What happens when an undercover CEO walks into his own store, only to find lazy employees, rude service, and a manager who couldn't care less? He doesn't just watch, he takes action. But no one knows who he really is, yet. This is the story of a CEO who went undercover to expose the cracks in his company, and what he discovered will shock you. Stay tuned, because today we're diving into a real-life lesson in leadership, accountability, and the power of recognizing the right people. Let's get started. David Langford sat behind his sleek office desk, staring at yet another customer complaint email. It wasn't just one or two. Reports of rude employees, unhelpful staff, and poor customer service had been piling up for months. As the CEO of Urban Outfitt & Co., a thriving retail clothing chain, David had spent years building his company from the ground up, emphasizing quality service and a strong work ethic. But lately, something has gone wrong. The feedback from customers painted a different picture, one where employees ignored shoppers, managers failed to lead, and the very principles he had instilled seemed forgotten. Frustrated, David knew he couldn't rely on corporate reports or sugar-coated manager updates. If he wanted the truth, he'd have to see it for himself. Dressing in faded jeans and an old hoodie, he left the comfort of his executive office and walked into one of his largest retail stores as an average customer. No suit, no name tag, no entourage, just a man blending into the crowd, ready to observe firsthand what his company had become. The moment he stepped inside, he took in the scene. Employees chatting in small groups, customers struggling to get help, and fitting rooms in complete disarray. He had built this company with a vision of excellence, but what he saw now was disorganization, apathy, and entitlement. David took a deep breath, adjusting the baseball cap he wore to stay unnoticed. If this store was a reflection of the rest, then he had a serious problem, one he planned to fix from the inside out. David wandered deeper into the store, observing everything with a critical eye. The shelves were well stocked and the displays looked decent, but the energy of the place felt off, as if the employees were simply going through the motions without any real investment in their jobs. His first real test came when he approached the customer service desk, where a young woman named Samantha sat behind the counter, completely engrossed in her phone. A line of 3 customers waited impatiently, shifting their weight and sighing loudly, yet Samantha remained unfazed, lazily scrolling as if she hadn't noticed them. David stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Excuse me, I need some help." Without looking up, Samantha held up a finger. "1 second," she muttered, continuing to tap away at her screen. David glanced around, half expecting someone else to step in. Another employee passed by but barely acknowledged the growing line of frustrated customers. The seconds dragged on. 1, 5, 10, 20, and still, Samantha didn't move. Finally, with an exaggerated sigh, she looked up, her expression one of complete disinterest. "What do you need?" David remained calm, masking his irritation. "I'm looking for a jacket I saw online. It says it's available at this location, but I don't see it on the racks." Samantha rolled her eyes. "Yeah, well, if it's not out there, we probably don't have it." David raised an eyebrow. "Could you check the stockroom? It might still be in the back." She laughed under her breath, shaking her head. "Not my job. You can ask someone else." Then, as if that ended the conversation, she turned back to her phone, completely dismissing him. David felt his blood boil. His entire business had been built on customer service and attention to detail, yet here he was, being treated as an inconvenience in his own store. But instead of reacting, he simply nodded. "Got it," he said, with forced politeness, stepping away. As he moved toward the aisles, he noticed something else. This wasn't an isolated issue. A group of employees stood near the fitting rooms, laughing amongst themselves, oblivious to a woman struggling to get assistance. At the checkout lanes, a long line had formed, but instead of helping customers, the cashiers were gossiping and sipping drinks. David exhaled slowly. He had come here looking for the truth, and he had already found it. The problem wasn't just a bad employee, it was a broken store culture. David moved through the store with a newfound sense of purpose, his earlier irritation now giving way to focused observation. It wasn't just Samantha's dismissiveness, it was everything. The culture inside the store was rotten, and the signs were everywhere. Near the fitting rooms, a group of 3 employees stood together, laughing and scrolling through their phones, while ignored piles of discarded clothing sat waiting to be put away. A woman with a handful of items hesitated near the fitting area, clearly looking for assistance, but after waiting for a few moments with no response, she sighed in frustration and dumped her items onto a nearby rack before walking away. Not one employee even noticed. David continued walking, his gaze shifting toward the checkout lanes. A long line of customers stretched impatiently toward the registers, yet the 3 cashiers stood chatting casually, showing no urgency to help speed things up. One was lazily scanning items at a snail's pace, another leaned against the counter while sipping a drink, and the third was openly scrolling on her phone, ignoring the customers entirely. A middle-aged woman in line let out a loud sigh and stepped forward. "Excuse me, could someone open another register? We've been waiting for nearly 10 minutes. The cashier with the drink barely looked up. "Yeah, someone'll get to it." Then she went right back to her conversation, unconcerned with the growing tension in the line. David clenched his jaw, watching the utter lack of professionalism. It wasn't just laziness, it was an environment where poor work habits were accepted and even encouraged. Employees had grown entitled, acting as if customers were an afterthought instead of the reason the store even existed. He decided to test the waters himself. Stepping toward the registers, he gestured at the growing line and asked one of the cashiers, "Why not open another lane? The wait is getting long." The girl with the phone scoffed. "Not my problem. That's the manager's job." David tilted his head slightly. "And where's the manager?" She shrugged, "Probably in the back." There was no urgency, no leadership, and no accountability. The employees didn't care, and the customers were suffering for it. David had seen enough. This wasn't just a bad day, it was a systemic problem. The store had fallen into a culture of apathy, where hard-working employees were rare, and those who actually cared were mocked for putting in effort. His next stop was the manager's office. If leadership was supposed to set the tone, then he was about to find out why this store had gone so completely off-key. David took a steadying breath, pushing down his frustration as he continued walking through the store. Everywhere he looked, he saw neglect. But then, in the electronics section, something different caught his eye. Among the disengaged employees, one stood out. A young sales associate, Liam, was kneeling beside an elderly man, patiently explaining how to set up a new smartphone. While other employees treated customers as a burden, Liam actually listened, nodded, and answered every question with care. David lingered nearby, watching. The elderly man squinted at the phone's screen. "I'm just not good with technology, son," he said apologetically. Liam smiled reassuringly. "No worries, sir. I'll walk you through it step by step. We'll get this figured out together." David noted how Liam didn't rush or look impatient. Instead, he took his time, ensuring the customer felt comfortable. This was exactly the kind of service David had built his company on, service that clearly still existed, but was now drowned out by mediocrity. Once the elderly man thanked him and walked away, David decided to test Liam further. He stepped forward and said, "Hey man, I need some help finding something." Liam immediately turned to him with a genuine smile. "Of course! What are you looking for?" David gave him a vague request. "I saw a jacket online that should be in stock, but I don't see it on the floor." "Got it. Let me check the back for you," Liam said without hesitation. Unlike Samantha at the customer service desk, he didn't make excuses or dismiss the request. He just took action. As Liam hurried off, David glanced around and saw something troubling. A few feet away, Jake, one of the slacking employees, leaned against a display, smirking as he watched Liam. When Liam returned with the jacket, Jake let out a scoff. "Dude, are you serious? You actually went to check the back for this guy?" Liam frowned. "Yeah, that's part of the job." Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "Man, you really go all out, huh? What, you trying to impress corporate or something?" David noticed Liam hesitate for a split second, clearly uncomfortable with being mocked for simply doing his job. But then, to David's satisfaction, Liam stood his ground. "I just believe in treating customers right," he said firmly. Jake rolled his eyes. "Whatever, have fun being management's pet." David clenched his jaw, watching Jake walk off with a smug grin. That single interaction confirmed everything he had suspected. Laziness wasn't just tolerated, it was the norm, while employees like Liam were ridiculed for actually doing their work. David exhaled slowly. Liam represented what this store was supposed to be, but he was outnumbered by employees who had given up. And that was the real issue. It wasn't about one bad employee or a single lazy manager. It was the store's entire culture that needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. And David was about to make sure that happened. David had seen enough. He turned toward the back of the store, moving with purpose as he searched for the manager's office. If there was anyone responsible for allowing this toxic work culture to thrive, it was the person in charge. He reached the door and knocked firmly. Silence. He knocked again, still nothing. Finally, he tried the handle. Unlocked. Pushing the door open, David's suspicions were confirmed. Inside, Marcus, the store manager, was kicked back in his chair, feet propped up on the desk, scrolling through his phone with a half-empty coffee cup beside him. A few crumpled receipts and old reports lay scattered across the desk, but it was clear nothing productive had been happening in this office for a long time. Marcus barely glanced up. "Can I help you?" he asked, sounding more annoyed than professional. David remained composed. "Yeah. There's a long line at checkout and your employees aren't opening another register. Customers are frustrated." Marcus let out an exaggerated sigh and casually set his phone down. "They know how to handle it," he said lazily. "They'll get to it eventually." David narrowed his eyes. "Shouldn't you be stepping in?" The manager finally looked up at him, irritated now. "Look, I don't know what your deal is, but if you don't like the service, you can take your business somewhere else." David bit back a smirk. Oh, if only this guy knew who he was talking to. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a quick tap, he sent a text. 1 minute later, the doors swung open. Standing there was Charlotte, the regional manager, a sharply dressed woman who carried herself with authority. Unlike Marcus, she knew exactly why she was here. Marcus looked confused. "Can I help you?" Charlotte didn't even acknowledge him. Instead, she turned to David and spoke with absolute professionalism. "Sir, what's going on?" The color drained from Marcus's face as he looked back at David, really looked at him for the first time. His posture stiffened as realization dawned. "Wait. You're..." David took a slow step forward. "I'm the guy you just told to take his business elsewhere," he said evenly. "And I own this business." Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came out. Panic flickered in his eyes as he scrambled for an excuse. I didn't know who you were. If I had known..." David shook his head. "That's exactly the problem. You should treat every customer with respect, not just the ones who can fire you." The office was dead silent. Charlotte finally broke it. "Sir, what do you want to do?" David didn't hesitate. "He's done." Marcus shot up from his chair. "Wait, what? You can't just..." "I can," David interrupted, "and I just did." Marcus stood frozen, face pale, as Charlotte gave him a curt nod. "You'll need to gather your things." David turned toward the door. "And while you're at it, I'm making more changes, starting now." It was time to set things right. David stepped out of the manager's office, his expression unreadable, but inside he felt a calm, steely resolve. The rest of the store was about to get a wake-up call. Employees had been ignoring customers, slacking off, and ridiculing those who actually worked hard. That was about to change, immediately. He walked straight to the customer service desk, where Samantha was still glued to her phone, completely oblivious to the chaos unfolding in the store. David stopped in front of her, placing a business card on the counter. "I need to return something," he said evenly. Samantha barely glanced at him. "Do you have a receipt?" she asked in the same disinterested tone as before. David tapped the business card. "That's my receipt." Confused, she looked down, and then her face went pale. She read the name on the card, her eyes darting back up to meet his. "You..." she stammered. David nodded. "The owner." "And you? You're fired." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, struggling for words. "But you had no problem disrespecting customers, refusing to do your job, and mocking good employees. So now? You have no job." Simple. Samantha stood frozen, her phone still in hand. Meanwhile, other employees had started to notice what was happening. Conversations hushed. Heads turned. Even the cashiers who had been ignoring the long line suddenly snapped to attention. David let the weight of the moment settle before continuing. He glanced around, his voice carrying across the store. Things are about to change around here. Nervous shuffling spread through the employees. Some shifted uncomfortably, realizing that their laziness was no longer going unnoticed. Others, like Liam, who had worked hard despite the toxic environment, looked on with something closer to relief. David turned back toward Charlotte, who had been standing nearby, observing everything with approval. "We're cleaning the house," he said. "Starting today." Charlotte nodded, already on it. David let out a slow exhale. This was just one store, but it was a clear example of a much bigger problem, and if this kind of toxic culture was happening here, it was happening elsewhere in the company too. And he wasn't going to let it continue. With the dead weight finally being cut, David turned his attention to the employees who actually deserved to be here. He scanned the store until he spotted Liam, who was still hard at work, now helping a mother with a restless toddler. Despite everything going on around him, Liam remained calm, professional, and attentive, explaining product details while the child tugged impatiently at his mother's sleeve. David waited until the woman thanked Liam and walked away before stepping forward. "Hey," he said casually, as if he were still just another customer. Liam turned and smiled. "Need help finding something else?" David smiled back. "Actually, yeah. I need to find the right people to run this store, and I think I just found one." Liam blinked. I'm sorry?" David extended his hand. "I'm the owner of this company, Liam, and I just fired your store manager." Liam's jaw dropped. His eyes flickered to the group of employees standing nearby who had clearly been eavesdropping. Even Samantha, still reeling from being fired, looked up from her phone in disbelief. David continued, "From what I've seen today, you're one of the few people here who actually cares about doing the job right. You take initiative, you respect customers, and you don't let people like Jake make you feel bad for actually working." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I'm promoting you." Liam stared at him, stunned. "Promoting me? To what?" "To assistant store lead, effective immediately." A murmur spread through the nearby employees. Some looked impressed. Others, like Jake, who had mocked Liam earlier, looked visibly annoyed. Liam swallowed hard, shaking his head. I don't even know what to say." David smirked. "Say yes." Liam took a deep breath, his posture straightening with newfound confidence. Then he nodded. "Yes. Absolutely yes." David clapped him on the back. "Good. Charlotte will handle the details, but just know, you earned this. Hard work gets rewarded in my company." Liam's eyes gleamed with gratitude and disbelief, but David wasn't done yet. He turned back to the rest of the employees. "And as for the rest of you," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire store to hear, "things are about to change." The employees who had been slacking off suddenly looked nervous. Others, like Liam, stood a little taller. David had just set a new standard, and he wasn't backing down. David knew that fixing one store wasn't enough. If this level of negligence and entitlement existed here, it was likely happening in other locations too. He couldn't afford to let his company continue down this path. Standing near the checkout, he pulled out his phone and typed a message to Charlotte. "Initiate full-scale evaluations. Surprise inspections start immediately." Within seconds, she replied, "Already in motion." As David scanned the store, he noticed the immediate shift in employee behavior. The once slacking cashiers were now rushing to assist customers, floor associates were organizing displays, and even the fitting room attendants suddenly seemed eager to help. But David wasn't fooled. Fear was driving this change, not genuine improvement. That's why he needed more than just a quick fix. He needed long-term cultural reform. Over the next few weeks, company-wide changes were rolled out. Surprise inspections across all stores. Leadership evaluations, managers who failed to uphold company values were fired or reassigned. Employee accountability programs, rewarding those who worked hard and calling out those who didn't. Some resisted the change. A few managers resigned, unwilling to adapt to the new expectations. Others were terminated when it became clear they had no intention of stepping up. But for those who embraced the shift, the company began to transform. Customer satisfaction scores rose, sales, which had been stagnant for months, started climbing. Employees who had once been overlooked, the Liams of the company, were now rising through the ranks. And through it all, David personally visited stores not as a CEO in a suit, but as a leader who wanted to see his company thrive from the ground up. This wasn't just a business, it was his legacy, and he was making sure it would stand strong. Weeks later, David walked into the same store where it all began, but this time, everything felt different. The floor was clean, employees were engaged, and customers were being helped without frustration or delay. At the checkout, multiple registers were open, and at customer service, a new employee greeted him with a smile instead of a dismissive glance at their phone. Most importantly, Liam stood confidently in his new role as assistant store lead, overseeing operations with a natural leadership that had once gone unnoticed. David lingered for a moment, watching Liam assist a younger employee who was struggling with a difficult customer. He handled it with patience, professionalism, and authority. Exactly what this store had been missing before. Seeing Liam succeed reaffirmed everything David had fought for. Hard work deserved recognition, and leadership wasn't about titles. It was about action. As he stepped outside, David took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. This was just the beginning. There were still more stores to fix, more leaders to cultivate, and more standards to uphold. Pulling out his phone, he made a final call. Schedule another surprise visit. We're not done yet. Because real leadership didn't end with fixing what was broken. It meant making sure it never fell apart again. The story of David Langford's undercover mission highlights a crucial lesson in leadership, accountability, and workplace culture. It reveals that a company is only as strong as its foundation, the employees who run it daily. Leadership isn't just about making decisions from an office. It's about being present, understanding real challenges, and taking action. One of the biggest takeaways is that neglect at the top leads to decay at the bottom. The store's toxic culture didn't happen overnight. It was a result of weak leadership, unchecked laziness, and a lack of accountability. Employees like Liam, who genuinely cared about their work, were overshadowed by those who didn't. But when leadership stepped in and rewarded hard work while removing toxicity, everything changed. This story teaches that success isn't just about hiring people. It's about fostering an environment where good employees thrive and bad habits don't go unnoticed. A company that fails to value its workers, customers, and standards will inevitably crumble, no matter how big it is. In the end, true leadership means leading by example, recognizing those who deserve it, and never assuming a company runs itself. Great businesses aren't just built, they're maintained with vision and action.